The Fuji X100V stands out among all other digital cameras because of its very special leaf shutter, which it shares with all the previous versions of this X100 series, which have been out since 2011, and I've owned every single one of them. What makes it special because of this leaf shutter is that the flash will synchronize at every shutter speed, up to 1/4000th. And because of that, this tiny little microscopic flash that normally couldn't do anything to compete against daylight and direct sunlight and outdoor bright light to give great-looking fill flash works great. Why does a high sync speed help us do that? Because the high sync speed means that at a 4,000th of a second or a 2,000th or a 1,000th, the flash duration is only about that long. That means for that picture, the flash is running the entire length of the exposure. So the ambient light is being cut way down by about a factor of 20 compared to, say, a 1/200th of a second sync on a normal camera. And because of that, we can take pictures with this camera that I can't take with any other camera, which essentially is a compact camera that gives me great results in any light, especially of people. Let's take a quick look at some of the pictures I can take with this camera. First off, here's a Ferrari. Now, what you can't even see is the subtle effect that the built-in flash has. The built-in flash is actually lighting up that ceramic brake disc, which you wouldn't see as well with every other camera. And because the flash is so close to the axis of the lens, there's very little shadow cast from the spokes of the wheel. And, oh my gosh, this is shot at 1/280th of a second, which is no big deal because it was overcast light. But the key is, no other interchangeable lens camera that's sold today can synchronize that fast with the traditional flash sync. High-speed FP flash doesn't count because it wastes most of the flash power. Here's a picture of my pup. Again, this is 1/550th of a second, which is so fast that it cuts down the ambient light and lets the little built-in flash light up my dog, who otherwise would have been in almost complete shadow against the daylight here. Now, overall, all of the Fuji digital cameras have relatively subtle or sedate or subdued colors, which are perfect for people pictures, but iffy for nature and landscape. So I don't use my Fujis for nature and landscape because I shoot everything as JPEG. If you shoot RAW, then the colors you get are entirely dependent on the software that you choose to use to create actual images from the raw data. That's not the scope of this discussion. Everything you see here is as it was shot out of the camera as a JPEG file. And these colors here with this kelp aren't that exciting. With this shot, the flash was off, f5.6 at a 600th of a second at auto ISO 160, 100% automatic dynamic range. Here's another sample. Relatively ho-hum contrast for nature and landscapes, which admittedly is not my style, but might be your style. Some people love taking quiet, long time exposures, make things look very simple and quiet. Although that's not me. I like loud things that hit you in the head. This shot here flashes off f5.6 at 1/1000th at auto ISO 160, which is the base lowest ISO for this camera, the lowest standard ISO. And this is at 100% dynamic range. And this is exactly a shot. This camera gets super close. Now, the way to get bright colors with this camera is the same as how to get bright colors with any camera, which is to find something very colorful and take a picture of it, which is what I've been doing for many, many decades when I would amaze people with my film photography and show them slides. It's the same film that was in the camera and had brilliant colors, but I could shoot real via. But anyway, I digress. This little shot here is at 4.5 at a 300th of a second with the flash on, which helps keep that backlit flower from getting too dark. I can set the dynamic range up to 400% for this shot here, which let me capture both the sun and all the surrounding clouds. I used minus 1 1/3 stop of exposure compensation because I didn't want to lose the sun and retain detail everywhere. This is at f14 at 1/5800th of a second at ISO 640, which is what you get when you shoot at 400% dynamic range. This shot here of an MGT is super sharp. And another nice thing is, again, I use the flash for most shots. The flash is on here, which helps highlight the front of the car, which otherwise was kind of in shadow on this overcast day. It emphasizes what's important, which is the front of the car, and less emphasizes the background, which could be disturbing. Also, too, this camera always amazes because the flash is on, but this was shot at 1/350th of a second, which is unobtainable with flash in a standard synchronization mode with any other interchangeable lens camera today. And let me shoot it at 4.5 at ISO 320 to keep the backgrounds just as soft as I wanted them. Here again is a sample of pointing it at something brightly colored to get a brightly colored photo. Again, the flash is on. This is f5.6, sort of backlit, at 1/850th of a second. Again, completely unobtainable with any other digital camera other than this one today. And mind you, all the X100 series cameras do share the leaf shutter, which is unique to this fixed lens camera because it's actually inside the elements of the lens. So interchangeable lens cameras, except for some very special medium format ones, don't have a leaf shutter and can't synchronize it fast. Here's my little dog again, indoors. Now this shows you how sharp is this new lens at f2, wide open at close distances. I never noticed with my older cameras, their lens was supposedly very soft, wide open at super close distances. Well, guess what? In the 9 years I've been shooting this series, I never did something as silly as shooting very close at f2 because then nothing is in focus. This shot here of my dog is only partially as close as the camera will focus, but the key is this new lens is now ultra sharp even at f2, even at the closest focal distances. This shot again, the flash is on, 60th of a second, 100% dynamic range. Is the camera sharp? Yes, of course it's sharp. Every digital camera is super sharp today. Here's a picture of a flag hanging. This is at f7.1 at 1/1600th of a second, no flash, 200% automatic dynamic range. Some more great things about this camera. This is a real camera. This is not some rubbish offshore to some communist country just to find the lowest possible denominator for cheap labor. This camera is made domestically in Japan, hallelujah, as have all the X100 series. It's almost all metal. I mean, honestly, this is almost all metal. You can read my written review for all the details. This top panel is billet aluminum, just like a MacBook Pro. This is a plastic cover, but it's nifty that they even painted the plastic cover here to match the finish of the camera. These dials are all metal. The shutter button's all metal. It's threaded for real cable release. This is all metal, and it feels much better than a Nikon DF, which are actually plastic, which were metal shells on buttons, and dials, which are actually plastic underneath. This lever's metal, all these rings are metal, this trim ring is metal, the lugs are metal, the bottom is metal. This is plastic. This is an extremely well-made camera. It's actually made at least as good as the Leicas are. I prefer this to the Leicas. This has another unique thing about the X100 series is a combined electronic and optical viewfinder. You can shoot live view through the viewfinder with an electronic finder, just like all the Sonys, or you can shoot with a purely optical finder, just like the Leica M series. You have your choice, and it is so smart that you can set it to shoot with the optical finder and have playback magically pop up an instant later as the electronic finder. You can even set it to drop in an insert of a magnified electronic part of the image to help you with focus, even though the rest of the viewfinder is optical. Although, to be honest, I always shoot with the electronic finder. If I'm shooting sports in action, this is not a sports in action camera. It's too slow with its autofocus. It's like every other mirrorless camera short of Sony. It's not the camera for sports in action. But it does have an optical finder if you prefer that. It's also fantastic for handling. If you want to change your apertures or exposure modes, you just do it with this metal ring. Same thing for this. Notice there's no mode dial. There's no mode control button. It doesn't need that. If you set both the aperture and the shutter to A, you get program auto exposure. If for some reason you want a slower shutter speed, you can, of course, flip this dial to get a shifted program, but just turn this dial. You don't even have to take your eye off of the subject and just count clicks, and you can set it down to, say, 1/8 of a second to get fill flash with a slow sync. You don't even have to change the sync because when you set it down to 1/8 of a second, it's going to force 1/8 of a second to do its thing. Or let's say you're shooting outdoors and suddenly want to get shallow depth of field. Just with your eyes on the subject, not even thinking about the camera, just move this all the way to f2, and then you can count clicks to get to wherever else you want to get. And it forces aperture priority when you set a fixed aperture. It's sad that no other cameras other than the Contax are this smart. Contax cameras did this back in the 1990s. And none of the other manufacturers have figured this out. But Fuji certainly has. So I love that about this camera. And that's why this is my favorite family vacation outing, people and group and indoor and school photography camera, because it gets great results with people with its flash under any kind of lighting. It has great face recognition autofocus. So I just point and shoot this from any crazy angle. Like all cameras today, you hold it up to your face, you get the viewfinder, you take it away, it'll light up the rear LCD. This camera, I can't say enough about it for practical photography. What's new? Now, all of these X100 series cameras are great. Each year, they just get a little faster and add a few new features, which if it's important to you, like facial recognition, as of the 3rd version, that was critical. This is the 5th version. Let's see what's new compared to the 4th version, which was the X100F. This new camera is weather resistant. However, you have to use a filter on the front. Otherwise, because this lens moves in and out, then it's not weather resistant. But I'll show you how I use a filter later on in this video. So I always use a filter. So it's weather resistant, although I've never needed that. As I covered, this is a new lens. You'll notice the 2 on it. The only optical difference is it doesn't focus quite as close. It gets about 90% as close, which is super close, and I wouldn't worry about the difference. However, this camera is about 90% sharper wide open at f2 at close focus distances, which I never do because if I want a sharp picture, I stop it down. So I've never even noticed that the old lens was softer until I deliberately compared them, but it is. The new camera here is made of solid billet aluminum. The older cameras were magnesium or other things. Does it matter? No. This has a 26 megapixel sensor. I don't really care. The original 60 megapixel sensor was more than enough for anything I did. The base ISO, the lowest ISO, now starts at ISO 160 due to the higher resolution. The older camera with 24 megapixels started at ISO 200. The rear LCD has a few more pixels than the old model. The rear LCD pivots, but it only goes this far up or this far down. Do I care? No. I was perfectly happy just looking at it from an angle if I had to shoot from above or below. What is important, which is rarely known, is the new mechanical leaf shutter with this new lens shoots at a 4,000th of a second from f4.5 and all other apertures, and it shoots at a 2,000th of a second all the way even at f2. The older shutter, you had to shoot at smaller apertures at some of the higher speeds, although I don't know if anybody really cared, but that is important if you're like me and wanted to shoot flash at high shutter speeds and large apertures. The face detection autofocus is now rated down to light value -5 with face and eye detection. Contrast detection only goes down to light value -2. The previous model had phase detection rated down to light value -3, so this new camera is at 4 times as sensitive. The electronic finder now has 3.69 megadots of OLED. The old finder had 2.36 megadots of LCD. Do I care? No. This new camera has slightly better performance for power. It's now rated 350 shots with the finder as opposed to 270 for the old one. That power saving supposedly comes from the OLED versus the LCD in the finder. Manual shutter speeds can set all the way down to 15 minutes. What you do is you set time, and then on the back of the camera, you'll notice it goes all the way to 15 minutes. That is new, and if you like to do time exposures, that's awesome. It even works in shutter priority mode. If I set this to auto, it's now going to pick an aperture for me based on a 15-minute exposure. Pretty cool. There's new and HDR mode that goes to 800%. The built-in neutral density filter, which all X100 series cameras have had, now is 4 stops rather than 3. The one thing that's missing, which is significant, is there's no longer a 4-way rear controller. The way they have you do things now is with functions that I less prefer, which are called touch functions, which by swiping your finger across the frame, you might or might not be able to get it to make some adjustments. Honestly, I find this a bit pokier than just having a button to get me to my modes. A little bit bad that's new about this camera is all these buttons are now very flush to the surface. It's very difficult to feel these with your finger while you're shooting without having to look at them. The older cameras had buttons that poked out a little more. This new camera does 4K video as opposed to the old camera that stopped at 1080. Do I care? Not really. And the reason I don't care is my iPhone, on which I'm shooting this video right now, gives me better results with better color, better dynamic range, better autofocus, and better everything, and also shoots 4K. There is no stabilization of any kind in any of these X100 series cameras, not even electronic stabilization for video, which means all videos, unless you mount it on a tripod, which completely wastes the point of having a compact camera, are going to look amateurish and shaky, as opposed to the iPhone, which has fantastic stabilization. You don't even need a gimbal with an iPhone. You can walk with it, and it just locks the image down like you're shooting on rails. So I wouldn't waste my time shooting video with this camera, but I don't really shoot video with anything other than my iPhone. That's just me. It's now USB-C, as opposed to micro USB on the other ones. It's only 4 grams heavier than the older X100F. It's a couple of percent wider and deeper than the X100F. It no longer includes the BCW126 charger, which all the older ones included that used the same kind of battery. And that's fine because I never need that charger now because today with this battery, I charge over USB-C. One less thing to carry with me, just a cord. There's no longer a choice to turn off the lens modulation optimizer in the menu system. It's always on. The power management of this camera is excellent. I can always leave the power turned on. I set the 15 seconds for timeout, or you can set whatever you like. And the point is the camera magically turns out every time it's supposed to when you're not using it, and always wakes up simply by tapping the shutter button. Some other brands of cameras do a crummy job. What's missing, other than missing the 4-way rear controller, again, it has switches for everything. Here's the autofocus mode switch, manual switches and dials and buttons for everything that have only one purpose. But what is missing is there's no flash button. There's no flash on-off slide switch, which I wish there was, because now I have to go to hit a menu and select that. I'm always turning the flash on or off. As I said, the most important thing by far technically in any photograph is the lighting. Same thing for any painting. The most important technical thing is the lighting. And having a switch someplace that would turn that flash on or off would be a big help, but none of them have that. But too bad. Also, the video only has a maximum take length of 10 minutes at 4K. This video I'm shooting here today on my iPhone has already run for 16 minutes live here in the studio, so this wouldn't even work for shooting this video. The limitation is 15 minutes for 1080p, so I don't consider this a real contender for video. There's absolutely no stabilization, so all your video results will look really bad unless you somehow mount this on something that's just a pain that you wouldn't need if you shot it on an iPhone. What's also missing is this ISO dial sounds nice, but that's a weird thing about this camera. It only goes from 160 up to the maximum of 12,800. None of the high modes, 25,000 or 51,000 are on here, or any of the low modes. You can't get to ISO 125, 100, or 80. You have to go into the menu system or set this to C, then set it on here. Then the problem is if you set that to C and set it on here, then you can't get to the auto modes. And if you set this auto mode here, that sounds good. But another good thing is this camera has 3 different auto ISO settings, but the only way to select through those, again, is to go into some kind of menu or touch function. So that's a weirdness of this camera. There are no detents on the ISO dial. This spins freely, which you may like or not like. It just feels a little odd not to have clicks on an ISO dial. There's no second card slot. So for serious use, it's not a matter of having a data error. More importantly, sometimes I have a photographer error. Well, I'll delete a picture or format a card that I forgot to download. And there's no protection against that with this camera. There's no ability to save and recall the complete camera states onto a card. That's unique to only the newest Sonys and to Nikons, and not present in other brands, and not present in Fuji. There's no GPS, there's no 720p or 420 or 480 or 640 or 525 or 65 video options. That goes with the territory today. It is 2020. Doesn't have a headphone jack, but it's got USB-C, so just use an adapter if you need one. Let's cover some details about performance. And again, the most details are present in my written review at kenrockwell.com. And simply go to my X100V review, and there's links to it from this video in the description as well, which will give you far more details and sample files than you can get in this short YouTube video. Focus breathing. You're really not going to care about focus breathing because that's a cinematographer term. This has very little focus breathing, but it does have a little. The image gets a little bit larger as focused more closely, which only matters if you're shooting movies. But as I said, the autofocus is fairly poor for this, and manual focus is fairly iffy. I mean, just because you're only on this electronically coupled ring, you can't really hook it up to a follow focus rig and make a lot of sense out of this. So while the manufacturers pitch these as save-alls for video, for those of us who actually worked in Hollywood for 10 years, I don't see this camera being a serious contender for video. For bokeh, it's pretty good. It's not superb, but it's pretty good. Remember, this is a short lens. It's a 35mm equivalent, 23mm lens, so even at f2, there's not going to be that much out of focus. Here's a shot at f2. You notice the background's soft, but it's not completely gone. Now, if I stop it down to f4, of course, more comes in focus. At f8, and at f16. Auto ISO works well. It's fairly flexible, and it's nice that it has 3 different settings. And it's even better that I don't even need the 3 different settings, because the only thing I usually change about auto ISOs is the lowest shutter speed. If I get into a situation where I'm, say, shooting sports, I can just force this to 500th right here. Or if I want to have fill flash at a slow speed, say an 1/8, I can just do that with this knob. No fiddling in menus required. I say, this is a camera for people who actually know how to shoot. You just set it and it goes. This is not a putzing in the menu kind of camera, but you certainly can putz in the menus if you like. Auto white balance works great in any light. It's helped by the fact that this is relatively a low contrast and low color saturation kind of camera. So unlike other cameras, I set up to about 13 for saturation, which exaggerates any errors in the automatic white balance. This camera always looks pretty good in any kind of crazy mixed awful lighting, which is how I have to photograph a lot of my people pictures. It'll be in a school under mixed fluorescent lighting and daylight, and then with my flash. And the camera handles these all remarkably well, probably better than any other brand of camera. There's no visible distortion, which again comes from both the great lens and the fact that it's always correcting for it electronically. Exposure is great. Pretty much no matter whatever I do, it never is more than a couple of thirds of a stop of exposure compensation, which again, I can just hit like this. So its meter is at least as good as every other camera. And again, it's a mirrorless camera, and it is extremely good because that's one of the strengths of mirrorless cameras is they usually get the exposure dead on. Light fall off is always invisible because it's corrected, and it's a great version of the lens as well. This is, of course, with the camera's JPEG image files. Here's at the largest aperture and going down. You can see a little bit here, but in actual shooting, you won't see any fall off whatsoever because this is exaggerating by putting on a gray background. I don't use any of the film simulations. I find they're really rather weak. I'm a huge Velvia shooter. The Velvia setting doesn't look like Velvia. It looks like a crummy scan of Velvia. You lose the shadows block up the black. Real Velvia doesn't do that. So I don't do that. I shoot everything in the standard picture control mode as a JPEG and play with it from there. The Finder is great, kind of like every camera. You know, my website's been on the air for over 20 years, and I've been shooting for over 50 years, so I've seen it all. This finder is nothing unusual. It's got the usual small optics, so the limitation is not the screen. The screen in here is fantastic. It's the fact that these optics aren't always the sharpest, and sometimes you're always tweaking a little bit depending whether or not looking at the sides or the center of it. But they all do that. And again, it's the finder. It has nothing to do with the quality of actual pictures. The optical finder is small. This is not like an old-style Leica or a Nikon SP from the 1950s that had life-size optical finders. It's only a half size, so it has a tiny optical finder, kind of like that on a disposable throwaway 35mm camera, which is odd because it could be a lot larger because it doesn't have to cover zoom lens, but that's just the way it is. But having an optical finder is just a little bit of gravy. It's a gimme on this one. There's no problem with flare or ghost with the lens, and I'll get into that when I cover Sunstars. The fill flash performance is superb. It's one of the key differentiators between this camera and every other interchangeable lens Fuji and every other camera from everybody else. The iPhone I love for most everything, but it has no really good fill flash for use in daylight. Its little LED-based flash isn't bright enough. Every other camera with a focal plane shutter just can't synchronize fast enough to let even a medium-sized flash work really well continuously in daylight. This camera with its tiny little flash and its ultra-high sync speed work just great for daylight fill flash. High ISOs are mediocre. Yeah, they're great. For anybody like me who's been shooting film, I mean, gosh, we couldn't used to get film even ISO 1600 that looked good. It certainly is better than anything ever from film. So if you're used to shooting a film Leica, this is going to run circles around it. But compared to real state-of-the-art APS-C camera like the Sony A6600, it's not that great. Now, the good news is if we look at complete images here at all the various ISOs, the lowest ISOs have higher highlight contrast. That's just how they make the L series of ISOs from ISO 125 to ISO 80. And if you really care and look fine in the corners, you'll see that some of the highlights go away because my lighting was too dynamic. It's not a fault of the camera. That's just a fault of the lighting. But in any case, choose any ISO you like. The overall pictures look about the same. The bad news is, which I don't really find acceptable today, is the pushed ISOs of ISO 25,600 and ISO 51,200. The color shifts, if you just noticed carefully. The color shifted a little more purple. That's not acceptable because the state-of-the-art cameras today retain the same color and the same look to the picture and the same contrast. So while the crazy high ISOs get a little more mottled, I'm not too impressed. Detail's okay, but to be honest, it's just not up to the state-of-the-art standard like a Sony A6600 would be. Yes, it's got detail, and yes, for any practical purpose, I mean, someone who knows what they're doing, I can take any camera you give me and get great shots and win contests and sell major jobs. But if you're the kind of person who'd rather sit around and is more concerned about high ISO resolution than the fact that you can just get your shot immediately by turning the shutter dial or change the aperture instantly without even losing track of what your subject's doing and get the shot, I much prefer this camera. But if you're a tweaker who'd rather sit around and look at high ISO images, this is inferior. For lateral color fringes, there are none, as shot as JPEG. As I said at the beginning, the lens modulation optimizer is always active. There's no way to turn it off. It's always present, always doing its thing. It looks great. But be forewarned, if you shoot RAW and then use third-party software other than the Fujifilm software, I can't guarantee that that third-party software is going to read anything about this camera and have the corrections to correct the lens if it needs any. So things like distortion, lateral color may or may not creep back into your image if you shoot RAW, but I don't shoot RAW. Macro performance is superb. Another fantastic thing about this camera is it focuses ultra close, just like an iPhone. Here's how close it gets. No attachments, no nothing. It just gets this close continuously in one focus range. This is shot at f2. It gets sharper stop down, but the key is even shot at f2, it is this sharp and looks pretty darn good. Movies. I don't like the movies. The image has no stabilizer, which means this camera is now condemned to having to be put on a tripod or a Steadicam rig, which, why would I do that with such a small camera? It doesn't focus that quickly for anything that moves, and if it's not moving, why would I be making a movie? And the audio is horrible. You'll notice these two little holes here, that's for the supposedly stereo microphone, but each of them are omnidirectional, so you've only got a half an inch of separation, which means that you basically are getting a mono image. If you watch this image here and listen to the sound, it's mono, or effectively mono. When I was there, this is a very stereo thing. I was in the middle of the ensemble. The guys had their voices panned hard left and hard right to different PA speakers, so it really was great in person, but it's not really good here. So I would pass on this. My iPhone makes far better stereo audio as well for video. Sharpness, as I said before, it's super sharp. I mean, anybody who worries about that is clearly a newcomer to photography, as even a 4K display screen only has 8 megapixels on it. So any camera with 8 megapixels or more is more than we can display, and the rest are simply thrown away. But camera makers don't want you to know that. Now, the leaf shutter for sound and vibration is nearly silent by itself, and you also can use the electronic shutter, which is completely silent. I find that the leaf shutter is silent enough, and I can use the flash with it. None of the electronic shutters out there today will let you shoot the flash along with the electronic shutter. So I set this camera to the combined mechanical plus electronic shutter mode, which automatically runs in the mechanical shutter up to a 4,000th, and then magically selects the electronic shutter above 4,000th up to a 32,000th. There is a little bit of hum as the lens focuses in and out, which you will hear in your videos, but as I said, don't try to shoot videos with this. Step up to an iPhone. Spherochromatism, which is also a secondary spherical chromatic aberration. There's a little bit on this camera. If we zoom in here, you'll see the background highlights have a little bit of cyan cast, and the foreground highlights have a little bit of magenta color cast. This is not that bad. It's a relatively wide lens, so I wouldn't worry about that. Sunstars? Sunstars are moderately good. Here's at f2. Now, that weird smear you see is actually caused by the fact that the leaf shutter is smearing that. As the leaf shutter opens for an extremely short exposure here. Now, mind you, the first shot at f2 was taken with the electronic shutter because it needed to be a very high shutter speed. But the leaf shutter helps smear that because it's super high shutter speeds. The leaf shutter doesn't open that much. And so you get the effect of two blades, which causes that smear at that angle. But as we get to the smaller apertures, you'll see we get a passable, pretty useful, certainly by f16, Sunstar. And don't worry about those weird little rainbow peacock dots all over the place. That's an artifact of how the sensor's laid out and the fact that I'm crazy enough to be shooting the sun straight, shining directly onto the sensor, but exposing with so much exposure that I can see underneath this tree. So I'm really doing bad things that I shouldn't be doing. On the normal use, you're not going to see that. This camera has a digital teleconverter. Just turn this ring on the normal operation, you'll get the equivalent of a 50 and a 70 millimeter lens for free. And it works really well, especially if you have the camera set to one of its lower resolution options. You don't even lose resolution as you step up to these other focal lengths. This is a Porsche in GT Silver. What's beautiful about this camera system is this is shot with the built-in flash, so while you can't see how dark the front of this Porsche would be, it's shot in backlight. The sun's shining straight into the lens above the top right shoulder of the car there, and the front would be completely black. But the flash on this camera works so well and integrates so well with ambient light, it looks very natural, which is another reason I love this camera. Playback is nothing unusual. It's slow to scroll around at the lower magnifications. Auto rotate doesn't really work. Auto rotate tall just makes a little picture fill up the screen. It doesn't magically go back and forth as you turn the camera like an iPhone does. For data, no news here, the same as all the other Fujifilm cameras. They don't format the cards properly. They format the cards with the title Untitled. So when you take the card out, and here's how you get the card out. When you take the card out, stick it in your computer, you're now seeing Untitled in your Mac Finder, and especially if you shoot more than one camera at a time, as I often do, you have all these things saying Untitled instead of saying something proper like X100V Fuji or X100V FUJ or however they do that. That's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. I have no idea how many pictures I really can take on this camera because it runs so long on a charge, I just haven't done that. Mine draws 487 milliamperes while charging from a regular 5-volt USB source, and it continues to draw 35 milliamperes after it's fully charged, which I think it is trying to keep the battery floating at 100%. I don't know if I agree with that, but it does continue to draw 35 milliamperes even when it's done charging. I have a complete user's guide. You can just follow the link at the end of this video. But let me just show you two of the things that I recommend off the top of my head. For filters, this is great. It has a real filter thread. There's only one catch. They made it backwards. This is a boy filter thread instead of a girl filter thread. So instead of screwing filters in the regular way, filters screw on upside down or backwards, see? Now what I do is, you could screw on just to filter the backwards, but then when the lens comes out, it's going to jam into your filter and not be able to focus closely. So what says Tiffin 49mm Sky is actually a filter out of which I took the glass, so it's just an extension ring. So now that allows me to mount my other filter on this camera. Then I take the camera's trim ring and mount it on the reversed. See, these are male threads pointing out. That's backwards. Mount it like this. This is my standard go-to. This is how I take the camera in the field. The other thing is straps. Now, Fuji includes all kinds of trim rings and protectors and tools to mount their crazy strap. I use the Leica strap. And the key is this is made in Germany. No, it's not cheap. It's not a $2 Chinese throwaway. I've had this probably for 13 years now. It's still like new. I just use it with whatever camera I have. To mount it on the camera, all you do is thread this through here like this. Pop that like that. Now watch this. This is a little bit of brilliance here. Click that. Installed. End of story. Don't have to break your fingernails trying to go through split rings or anything. So I use these straps. You can use whatever you want. I have owned every one of these cameras since they first came out. I love them because of the way they make my people pictures look. The autofocus is superb, just nails faces and recognizes eyeballs and so forth. So I can just point it in the general direction of a bunch of kids and I get my shot. Autofocus isn't super fast, but it is super smart. And so for people who are trying to at least get their pictures taken, as opposed to sports, I love this camera. When I have to photograph in a classroom, photograph an event, photograph a group of people, it's always my first grab because the pictures look better. Some people don't realize they worry about pixels and ISOs. Every brand of camera has a different look. Fujifilm has always been about people pictures. My Nikons and Canons are all about doing everything reasonably well, and Sonys are actually kind of blah. I don't get too excited about them easy, but for people pictures, the Fujifilm's the best because they're optimized for people pictures. Now, I wouldn't get this for nature and landscape because for nature and landscape, my insane vision requires insanely unnatural colors. I like super ultra vivid colors. I don't get those straight out of the camera for this, so it requires a little more processing. But for everything else, it's people. I love any of my X100s. Thanks for at least learning a little bit about the X100V. You can read the entire review at my website and also follow my complete knockdown, drag-out user's guide to every possible setting you could want to do with this camera. Oh, before I go, let me just show you two little settings. To set the touchscreen is nearly impossible. I have a completely other video on that. But to find the battery percentage, no one knows how to do this. I also have a video, but here it is. You press the display back button a bunch of times. Make sure you're in a picture-taking mode, not in playback. Keep pressing this until you get this data screen. And then in this data screen up at the top, you'll see the percentage for the battery right there. There's no other way to see that. If you're in playback mode, this won't work. If you're looking at the viewfinder, this won't work. You have to be in a ready to take a picture mode and hit the display back button a few times. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell, kenrockwell.com. All brought to you today at kenrockwell.tv.